Welcome to the 8th episode of our weekly El Monitor webinar series on the Israel-Hamas war and its impact on the region. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of El Monitor. The fighting continues today around Khan Yunis, the stronghold of Hamas leadership in southern Gaza. Israel claims that many senior and mid-level Hamas military commanders and political leaders have already been killed, among the more than 15,000 Palestinians killed in the Israeli military response to the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas, which killed 1,200 Israelis. 400 Israeli soldiers have been so far killed in the most intense fighting of the war so far in Gaza. And the pressure is on in Washington as Democrats, including Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, the latter in an exclusive interview for El Monitor last week and in an op-ed in the Washington Post today, calling on conditions for U.S. assistance to Israel. Our guests today are El Monitor Israel columnist Ben Caspit, coming to us today from Israel, and El Monitor State Department correspondent Elizabeth Hagedorn with us from Washington. Welcome to you both. A reminder to our viewers, please send questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Ben, let's start with you. This week, you had the scoop that U.S. officials are pressuring Israel to wind down this war by early January. Israel wants more time. We get a sense in watching the fighting in Khan Yunis that the decisive moment may be coming soon, if indeed they are as close to the leadership as may be expected. And this is in addition, I should say, to longstanding U.S. pressure over recent weeks to limit civilian casualties in the conflict. How is this U.S.-Israel friction playing out, and would you describe it as friction?
Yes, since 2 days ago, the Palestinians and the Israelis are reporting that the IDF is surrounding the home of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas. The only problem is that I guess he is not at home. The Hamas leadership is not where we think it is. And you are totally right, Andrew. We are in the decisive moments of this war. And I think it will take 1 or 2 weeks for these decisive moments to go on before we know where are we going exactly. But the original deadline that the administration is talking about with Israel is January 1st. And then I reported in a monitor that there was a very interesting conversation between a senior American official and an Israeli official. And the Israeli guy told the American, listen, but we both know that on January 1st, there is no Washington. You're in a holiday and you come back only on the 5th or the 6th. So 1 week we have already spare. So, and if we are talking about the end of January, so the gap is only 3 weeks, and it's a bridgeable gap. But and this is the actual situation. But the problem is the clock is not synchronized because the Americans are talking about 1 month. Benny Gantz and the General Gadi Eisenkot, who are in the war cabinet, are talking the same about the end of December or the mid of January. The problem is that Netanyahu is talking about half a year or maybe 1 year because his tactics is to have a very long war and hope the Israeli public will forget this October 7th disaster and Holocaust. The general in the Southern Command, Yaron Finkelman, is talking about 4 months. The Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, is talking about 1 year. So no one really knows when, and where this is going to end. We were not talking about we did not mention the North yet because we have a very, very hot day in the North today. A lot of attacks from Hezbollah and from Israeli Air Force. But I think the gamble, and I put my money where assuming on the end of this year, maybe 2 or 3 weeks inside the next year, we will see ceasing this kind of war, where you have, it was 3, now it is 5 Israeli heavy armed divisions inside Gaza. I think for the next format will be getting most of the forces out and start working in a very decisive on points like we're doing now all the years in Judea and Samaria. We have a problem in Jenin. We get into Jenin, solve the problem, arrest the terrorists, and get out. So I think this format of all-out war will last from now between 1 and 1.5 months.
Elizabeth, you're here in Washington. How do you see these divisions, if you'd call them divisions, playing out among the Biden administration? And is this a sign that the Biden administration is giving in to pressure from the left flank of its party? Or is it a calculated shift with those calling for conditions as a kind of bad cop to the Biden's kind of good cop in the approach to rein in Israel's military strategy and try to bring about an end to the conflict sooner rather than later?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrew, and I'm thrilled to be here with you, Ben. Biden's pledges of ironclad support for Israel have begun to cost him domestically, and this is as he and his party head into an election year and the death toll in Gaza rises. Polls show that Biden is losing the support of young progressive Democrats, as well as Arab and Muslim voters who want to see a permanent ceasefire. You're seeing that debate play out on college campuses across the country. Interestingly, as U.S. rhetoric that you alluded to has begun to shift to show more concern over the civilian death toll, Biden's standing has begun to rebound among Democrats. I just saw that in a poll out from the Associated Press this morning, but it could dip again, right? Biden's approach will be tested as Israel shifts its military offensive further south, where hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced over 2 months of war. And, what U.S. officials were telling journalists privately or on background is now what they're saying increasingly publicly. In recent days, we've heard blunt calls for Israel to exercise restraint from Vice President Harris and Defense Secretary Austin. Same for Secretary of State Antony Blinken. After meetings with Netanyahu and his war cabinet last week, Blinken said that Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world and therefore should be able to produce a clear plan that avoids mass civilian casualties and displacement like we saw in northern Gaza. But to your question, is that enough for Democrats? There was a lot of talk over whether they would condition aid to Israel when responding to the White House's request for $14 billion in emergency funding. Senator Van Hollen spoke of this, Andrew, in your interview with him last week. But the legislation released yesterday was basically a copy and paste from what the White House requested, interestingly enough. It included no such reporting requirements or conditions on how Israel used the military aid. And on a procedural vote held yesterday, Senator Bernie Sanders, who caucuses with the Democrats, was the only one of them actually to vote against it. So there is, I think, definitely a divide between Biden and some in his party, but perhaps it's not as wide as has been portrayed. Only 3 Senate Democrats, after all, and not even Sanders, have broken from the president to call for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza.
Thank you. Ben, let me ask a question about Israeli politics in the war. How is this playing out for Prime Minister Netanyahu? Obviously, you and many others have written about how there's a bitter divide in Israel and feeling about his leadership, how this could have happened on his watch. And he is apparently, according to polls and what we see in the press, may pay a pretty severe political price. But on the other hand, can he win in Gaza by taking out Hamas if they're able to kill or capture the top leadership? And could that be portrayed by Netanyahu as yet another means of his keeping control as prime minister?
Yes, this is a very good question, Andrew, but I'll start in announcing something. It was just now out in Israel that we lost today a young reserve commando fighter, who is also the son of the former Chief of Staff, General Gadi Eisenkot. his son, Gal Eisenkot, was killed today inside Gaza. By the way, while his father and his colleague Benny Gantz, another chief of staff, the two ministers in the war cabinet from the same party, were touring inside the street. And it's Israel is mourning this evening. Not only Gal, I think we lost 5 or 6 soldiers today. But to your question, Netanyahu right now is in his maybe all-time low, although after the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, he was in more or less the same situation. He was 25 points behind Shimon Peres, and he won the same election after less than 1 year. He came back from minus 25 and won. Right now, he has plans to win again. I'm not sure it's possible, although this is a magician that we said many times, not only myself, that he's finished, but he's the ultimate comeback kid. But because I don't think it's possible to have a win in Gaza after what they did on the 7th to Israel, to this regional superpower, this relatively small terror group, we call it a Holocaust. Not all the evidence are out yet. So many slaughtered civilians. You know, the whole region in Israel was deserted by the army for the whole day. So many, I think we lost more than 400 soldiers, and we lost the dignity. We were humiliated. Nothing that we will do will be able to wipe out this impression, and Netanyahu knows it. Yes, it will be very good for him and for all the Israeli nation to kill all the Hamas leaders, and I guess it will happen sooner or later, exactly like the decision of the Golda Meir government after the massacre in the Olympic Games in Munich. There was a government directive to kill all the terrorists that were involved. It took a few years, and we did it, but the impression and the blow to the slogan of Israel is huge. And one more thing, Andrew. The Netanyahu success was built on 2 bases. First was the economical base, because Israel was flourishing in the last 15 years, became maybe to the top 5 in the booming economies in the world, the startup nation, a cyber superpower, etc. So the economy was very good, standard of living very good, Western state, everyone is going abroad and buying new cars, and security was good. Netanyahu was avoiding military adventures. He was very cautious, even a coward, and nothing bad, really bad happened. Suddenly, those 2 bases collapsed. Nothing good. Avigdor Lieberman, when you call him, he said, the first thing he says, nothing good is threatening on us right now. So economy is not going to any good places in the next 2, 3, 4 years. We have a big chance, a good chance to have a lost decade now. And security. Israel, we have 200,000 refugees, Israeli refugees, double it 35 times to get the American figure. We deserted the Negev, we deserted the Upper Galilee right now. All the villages and towns are empty. So I don't see him coming back from this disaster. And I think the best gamble is a very close election, although his plan, like I said before, is having a very long war and trying to collect his coalition and his 64 Knesset members bloc as long as possible. God knows if he succeeds or not.
A reminder to our viewers, send your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Elizabeth, you wrote yesterday in your column the takeaway about the latest on concerns about women hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza. There was hope following the last round of hostage negotiations that all women, children, elderly would have been released, but many women are still being held. Tell us what you've learned and what the expectations are at this point.
Yeah, Andrew, Israel believes there are around 18 women, I think, at the latest count, still held in Gaza or unaccounted for. And what the US and Israel are saying is that Hamas refused to hand them over, despite pledging to release all the women and children, and that they did so without credible explanation. Interestingly, we heard the State Department spokesperson suggest on Monday, and this is hard to talk about, but that the reason Hamas had not released all the women as promised is that they didn't want those women to share their stories from captivity. The implication being that the women who are believed to be mostly in their 20s and 30s may have been subjected to sexual violence. And we know from the horrific eyewitness testimony, some forensic evidence, crime scene photographs, interrogations with captured fighters, and so on, that gender-based violence was carried out on October 7th. And it's possible, and some experts say more likely than not, that there are victims of that violence in Gaza right now. And you might be asking, I mean, this is a question I had, why would Hamas even care if the world knew its fighters had abused these women, given all the other atrocities it stands accused of? And, it matters from a PR standpoint. The group's own spokespeople have said that it's haram or forbidden in Islam. And those allegations could do real damage to the group's domestic credibility in Gaza. So I think that's why you see, I think it's telling that Hamas is going to great lengths to deny these charges, responding directly to a comment Biden made the other night in a way that you're not really seeing them do when it comes to allegations of other atrocities. I will say I spoke to a source familiar with the negotiations who said there is potentially another reason, in addition, that Hamas is holding on to some of these women who are believed to be in locations throughout Gaza, and that's that moving them could expose Hamas's strategic assets. So right now, what we know is that mediators from Qatar and Egypt are working to get those talks back on track as the Israelis expand their offensive in southern Gaza. Israeli officials I've spoken to have made the case that military pressure could actually bring Hamas back to the negotiating table. They say the first truce wouldn't have been achieved were Hamas not under strain from Israel's air and ground campaign. The administration, for its part, wants the pauses to continue until all the hostages are freed, including the 8 or so remaining Americans, one of whom is a woman and who they expected to be out by now.
If I may add, Andrew, we in Israel are praying to the safety of the two red-haired, very young boys. One is Kfir, is 10 months old, and his brother Ariel is 4 years old. And their mother and the father are hostages as well. Hamas reported they were killed in an Israeli air bombardment, but we don't have anything to prove it. And whatever was said right now by Elizabeth is accurate. We in Israel are very cautious in publishing all these items because we fear it will take its toll on the hostages that are in Gaza. Maybe Hamas will not want to release them or even kill them in order for them not to tell the world what happened. But the world will know what happened. I can tell you the dozens of the bodies of young women from the Nova Festival music were with a broken pelvis, and the fear of their eyes were full of fear. So you only have to imagine what happened to them. And we also have eyewitnesses to what happened, but you can learn it from the bodies. So we are in a huge trauma here. We just had a poll that close to 50% of Israelis are in deep depression. And I think it's unprecedented.
Ben, we've got a question asking about the post-war situation. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of speculation about post-war Gaza. U.S. has been suggesting the time to go big, propose a two-state solution, picking up the pieces on Saudi normalization and the Abraham Accords. Some division, it seems, between Washington and Israel over the role of the Palestinian Authority. Is Israel thinking beyond the military campaign? Netanyahu has ruled out the Palestinian Authority. But there seems to be some discussions about some arrangement, and you even had some suggestions of some prominent Palestinians who've been mentioned by top Israelis and off-the-record discussions who might play a role. Tell us, what's the latest on the thinking about post-war Gaza?
The Netanyahu next campaign is already out, and it says something like, only Netanyahu will stop the PA from getting Gaza. Netanyahu is well known by supplying the Israeli people an enemy. He needs an enemy so he can unite all his base behind him. Right now, when we are fighting Hamas, he was fueling Hamas with $30 million a month from the Qatari messenger for years, but Hamas, it's void. So he needs an enemy, and he marked the PA as an enemy, and this is his slogan. But everyone, including Netanyahu, knows that there is no alternative. You cannot invite or invent someone that will volunteer to take Gaza. If you ask the Egyptians, they will give you the pyramids, just leave them alone and don't mention Gaza, because they don't need this Muslim Brotherhood known as Hamas to help their own problem in Aswan. So what we are hearing from the American administration is something like revitalized PA. So let's have a huge reform in the Palestinian Authority. Let's clean it from corruption. Let's have election, and then we have the mentioned names that I wrote in that feature in Al Monitor, like people like Muhammad Dakhlan, who gains a lot of popularity. Money, he has no limits with. He stays in the Emirates, and he's a Gazan. And Nasser Akidwa, the nephew of the late Yasser Arafat, and also Dr. Salam Fayyad, he was prime minister of the PA back in the previous decade. So we have names, we have ideas, but nothing is. It's too early. When the cabinet is sitting, no one is talking. Minister Yoav Gallant, he don't want anyone to talk about the day after. He wants to talk only about the war and about the need to win it. And they are all afraid. And the problem is because the two ultra extremists in the government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they mark the PA as an enemy. And Netanyahu is their hostage. So this is the reason. Actually, what happens here is that all the state of Israel is hostage by Ben Gvir and Smotrich, because Ben Gvir and Smotrich, if you ask them, they prefer Hamas on the PA, because Hamas means no partner, no negotiation, only war. So they're extremists, and most of the Israelis know that we don't have any alternative, but we're captured, and we're all hostages. But if you ask me, on the day after, maybe some international force in the interim period of a few weeks or months, but we will all go back to the same Palestinians. All the Israeli attempts in the history, not only Israel, to lecture to some other people or to dictate who will be their dictator, were failed. We tried to do it in Lebanon. We tried to do it in the West Bank. The Americans tried to do it in Afghanistan and Iraq. It is not working.
Elizabeth, a follow-up question for you about the status of there are hundreds of Americans trapped in Gaza, and I think 8 Americans still held hostage by Hamas. Is that accurate? How is the administration also managing that piece in terms of its engagement with Israel regarding the conduct of the conflict?
It's a good question, Andrew. I'll break down those two groups. So you have the Americans believed to be held hostage by Hamas. 4 have come out since October 7th, including 4-year-old Abigail, but there are 8 Americans believed to still be there, including the one woman. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said recently that the U.S. doesn't have visibility into their physical conditions. we saw that Hamas released a group of Thai hostages as well as a group of Russians. Given the current situation, it seems very unlikely there would be any sort of similar release of just U.S. hostages. So I think all the pressure now is on, especially Qatar, to bring the two sides back into an agreement on the hostages. And then as far as the other group of Americans, the State Department has helped more than 1,000 U.S. citizens and their family members evacuate Gaza through the Rafah border crossing since early November. But about 370 American citizens remain, plus their family members, and these are people who've told the State Department that they wish to leave. Part of the issue in getting them out, as the State Department indicated yesterday, is that renewed fighting makes it difficult, if not impossible, in some circumstances, for them to reach Rafah safely. So the U.S. for now is advising them to travel at their own risk.
Ben, you wrote this week, and it's kind of picking up on what you said in your last set of remarks here about an international force, but there seems to be deep distrust, if not animosity, between Israel and the United Nations at this time. Maybe unprecedented in terms of what's been said about the Secretary General, the banning of certain UN officials, and the statements by the head of Shin Bet this week. Could you comment on that and the feelings about the UN and how that might affect a post-war situation?
Yes, I think the frustration is a very small word comparing to what we in Israel really feel. But it's not unprecedented. You will always have an example from Jewish or Israeli history that is worse. And I will remind you that once upon a time, the United Nations Assembly voted and approved the decision that Zionism is racism. And then President Herzog, he was then not our Herzog, his father, that was a president as well. He was then the ambassador to the UN, and he turned the paper apart on the stand in the General Assembly. Yes, the feeling is, it's not, by the way, Andrew, it's not only the UN. We follow what happens in the American campuses. The latest from the presidents of MIT and Penn and Harvard, that were not able to say that calling for genocide of Jews is something wrong. And in Israel, everyone is devastated. But seeing the head of Shin Bet, this is an anti-terror organization, he's not a diplomat, this guy, Ronen Bar, that is writing a letter to the Secretary General and telling him, listen, you have to, this is my word, you can find the quotes in Al Monitor, don't stop us, we had now a Holocaust, be ashamed of yourself. And this is unprecedented. Head of Shin Bet is dealing to his mission right now is to capture Yehia Sinwar, not to write to the Secretary General. By the way, many of them are coming here. I think the Deputy Secretary was visiting here, and she also came to see this Ronen Bar in the Shin Bet headquarters, and the German national security advisor, all of them are coming here, hearing the Israeli feeling towards what happens. And we have another question: how did we let it happen? We deserted this arena. We see the TikTok, what is going on there, which is controlled by the Chinese. We see what is going in the campuses, and it has three parts. There are anti-Semites, the veteran anti-Semites, the original, the new one, and then you have the young guys that don't know what they're talking about. They think that Hamas are freedom fighters. They think that they don't realize that the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, means that there is no Israel. From the river to the sea, this is where Israel is standing. And I can lecture, as you know me, a lot more, but the frustration in Israel is huge. And we see and we adore and admire the administration. We are aware of the difficulties, the mounting difficulties that President Biden suffers. And this is the reason. No one in Israel really thinks that we're going to fight for one more year. The big question is whether the Hezbollah front will be quiet or be ignited in the next few weeks. If it will be ignited, so we have to start all over again.
Elizabeth, you've reported on how there were sanctions again imposed on Houthi parties in Yemen. Obviously, there had been significant progress in the Yemen negotiations to resolve the Yemen conflict. That had been a priority of the Biden administration, and there had been traction, there had been success. What's happening on that front, and is the administration seeing this as a warning regarding Iran, and how are they thinking about that in a broader context?
Yeah, you're right. It was a top priority for this administration to end Yemen's war. And what's happening now, the Houthi escalation in the Red Sea, the drone and missile activity, its seizure of a commercial vessel, that could all undermine the work that Special Envoy Tim Lenderking and this administration have put into reestablishing a truce in Yemen, having Saudi Arabia eventually exit the war, and finding some sort of political settlement for a country that's been experiencing war and near famine-like conditions for almost a decade now. Just 3 weeks before Hamas attacked Israel, a senior Houthi delegation traveled to Riyadh in a rare visit. And, as one expert I spoke to said recently, if you're Saudi Arabia, how do you go into a larger peace deal now with a group that's launching rockets at Israel and hijacking ships? So I think the struggle now for the U.S. is both trying to keep diplomacy alive while also responding to the Houthis in a way that doesn't further escalate the crisis, but does deter them. And there have been calls for the U.S. to redesignate the Houthis as a terror organization. I'm told the White House is pushing for this. Today, we saw a step or two short of that. The U.S. announced sanctions this morning targeting Iranian oil sales and financial facilitators that are propping up the Houthi war machine in Yemen. So I think as far as next steps, we'll just have to see.
We are out of time. This was a fantastic discussion. I could go on much longer. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, viewers. You can follow Elizabeth and Ben at almonitor.com. Subscribing to Almonitor also gives you access to these fantastic webinars with our top columnists. So thank you both, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much, Andrew.